everyone. I want to welcome all of our attendees and our guest speaker today, Dr. Bir Khalsa. Before we start, I want to mention that I've seen a roster of registrations, and I know we have some old friends joining, and we're very grateful for your participation. We have a lot of new friends, and we're thrilled to have you today. I want to send a special shout-out and special thank you to all those who also donated to the foundation when registering. And without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Khalsa. He has been involved in the practice of yoga lifestyle for over 35 years and is a Kundalini yoga instructor. He has conducted neuroscience research for over 25 years and is currently an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. He is also the director of research for the Kundalini Research Institute and the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health, which I'm sure many of you know. His current research is on the effectiveness of yoga and meditation practices and includes studies on yoga for insomnia, music performance anxiety, and public schools, among others. He's also the driving force behind the annual symposium on yoga therapy and research of the International Association of Yoga Therapists. He also teaches an elective course at Harvard Medical School in mind-body medicine, and of course is the author of Your Brain on Yoga ebook, which is mostly what we'll be talking about today. I'll just call you Salbir, if that's all right.
Yes,
We've
please.
known each other for many years. We're thrilled to have you here today. And I wanted to start with this question. What got you interested in yoga research to begin with?
Well, that's a long story, but it goes back to the 70s. Not long after I began practicing yoga, it was clear to me that the changes that I had gone through with the practice of yoga were extremely beneficial and quite remarkable. And I had always had an interest in science, and so it was just natural for me to come to the conclusion that this was something that really deserved to be subjected to formal scientific research to show the benefits of this in a systematic way. And so I went back to college. I went back to university and got my PhD and did postdoctoral research, and made that decision in 1975, but was not able to actually start yoga research until 2001, when funding from the National Institutes of Health, specifically the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, became available to support that research. So although I was very interested in studying yoga in the mid-70s, I wasn't able to do it until 20 years later. But fortunately, I've been fully funded to conduct yoga research full-time for the past 12 years.
Isn't that you don't like it?
I have a follow-up question, but I'm still getting quite a bit of background noise, and so I wanted to ask the newcomers if you could please mute yourself by pressing *6. That will help us all hear better. Thank you. So how was it at the beginning? I mean, I've read your book, I've heard you speak, I've read quite a bit about yoga research, and so how was it at the beginning at Harvard Medical School?
Well, actually, as many people might think, Harvard would be is a leading medical research institution in the world. And many people might assume that, of course, there would be an enormous amount of resistance there. But in fact, Harvard and the Boston environment are actually very conducive to research in this area. In fact, we have more researchers in the Boston area studying mind-body medicine than anywhere else in the world. Harvard School actually has a Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine Research, It has.
Oh, I was listening to a webinar about yoga and the brain. It's something I had to dial into. Okay, turn it down.
Yes, could you please mute yourself by pressing *6? We will open up to questions later on.
And in addition,
interrupted him by coming.
Oh my goodness. Okay, let's hope that this was better.
So in addition to the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine at Harvard Medical School, there's also the Mind Body Medical Institute under Herbert Benson, which has been there and active for decades studying contemplative practices, particularly meditation practices. So actually the Harvard Medical School environment is conducive and very supportive for research in integrative medicine and contemplative practices like meditation and yoga.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And so, although you started, you were only able to start in 2001, you've kind of followed this, your interest of yoga research. And so, how did your experience lead to your book, your ebook, Your Brain on Yoga?
Well, I consider myself a scientific researcher, and so my work is to actually conduct research studies. I've also spent a lot of time collaborating with other researchers across the world to support and promote research on yoga. The ultimate outcome of that research is actually published peer-reviewed papers in biomedical journals. And so the idea of a book for the general public is actually not really of that much interest to me in that sense, because it's actually a distraction. It takes me away from my work in research and publishing peer-reviewed papers. The reason that I went ahead with this ebook was that I was actually approached by a division of Harvard Medical School called Harvard Health Publications. They actually invited me to write a book on yoga. And so the prospect of having a book out in the world that had on the cover the title, the word yoga, together with the phrase Harvard Medical School, was something that I simply could not turn down. So that's why I went ahead with the book. And it's actually a remarkable thing to have such a book out there with, by Harvard Medical School on yoga. 15, 20 years ago, this would have been unheard of. So it really is a sign. It really is a sign of the acceptance of yoga, both in the general public and even in the research community.
Yes, and it's a great book. I've really enjoyed it, and it's very well written, and I think it's very informational, and yet it's easy to understand for a lay person. So, let's get into the topic then. Before I ask that, my next question, actually, I want to ask, what is the difference between yoga and meditation?
Well,
I'm not sure that everybody knows, and I think it's an interesting point to make. Correct.
And there is a distinction in the West, in the United States, between yoga and meditation. However, if you go to India and you make that distinction between yoga and meditation, most people will look at you sideways because they don't understand that there's a difference between the two. And in fact, in the U.S., yoga has become very popular, and it has actually diversified. And the general public's impression of yoga is that it's actually a form of exercise. And, of course, there are many people who practice yoga strictly for the exercise virtue of it. However, there are many styles of yoga in the U.S. and in the West which are actually the traditional way that yoga has been taught and practiced, which is really as a contemplative practice. So in essence, yoga in its traditional form includes not only the postures and the physical exercises, but also the breathing techniques, and then importantly, and perhaps most importantly, the meditation and mindfulness practices that are an integral part of yoga practice. And historically, that was really the core of yoga practice was really that the postures, the exercises, breathing techniques are all there to support the meditative component. And the meditative component ultimately leads, after years of practice, to contemplative states of mind, changes in perspective, changes in self-identity, changes, really transformative changes in a positive direction. So yoga really is a contemplative practice that incorporates meditation. Now, having said that, there are, of course, disciplines of meditation practice that are just the meditation component. So, for example, the Buddhist Vipassana technique, or the meditation practice, is simply a purely cognitive technique that meditation, pure meditation, without the practice of the postures and the exercises. So yoga really incorporates both all of these elements in its traditional form.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for clarifying this. And I just want to interject one more reminder, please, for the newcomers. If you could please mute yourself by pressing *6 on your phone. It will help us all hear better and have less background noise. We would appreciate it. So tell us, how does yoga impact our health, and why does it work? Because I think that's the core of really why we practice yoga, because it improves our health. So how does it work, and how does it actually improve our health?
Well, most people that study yoga really study the traditional form of yoga, or traditional style of yoga. It usually includes all the components that I described, which is the physical postures, the exercises, the breathing technique, meditation. Each of those components of yoga actually has its own raft of benefits. And there's an intersection between the benefits from the different practices. So on the physical level, obviously, yoga includes a lot of isometric exercises, a lot of stretching. And so that, of course, improves muscular strength and endurance, muscular coordination, and particularly flexibility. And makes the body more supple, more flexible. The breathing technique actually improves respiratory function. So people learn how to breathe more effectively. They learn that the body adopts a breathing pattern that is more natural and more healthy, that is more stress-free. And those breathing techniques are actually now well known to affect stress systems, particularly the autonomic nervous system, in reducing stress. And then finally, we know an enormous amount now with recent research findings on the benefits of meditation practice. So what I'm calling meditation is, the definition of that is that it's a form of controlling your attention in a relaxed, passive manner and keeping your focus on some kind of target, whether that's a sound, a word, a candle, the flow of sensation, whatever. And the maintenance of that attention on that target is actually what meditation is. And when you meditate, now know that you engage what are called the attention networks in the brain. And these are very different from what goes on during regular thoughts when, you're sitting in the doctor's office or at a bus stop when the mind is wandering. And mind wandering, or so-called rumination, really engaging another set of networks in the brain called the default mode network. And the default mode network includes that whole idea of rumination. A lot of rumination is actually negative thinking. Most people, when their mind is wandering, are thinking about challenges, they're thinking about tasks, they're thinking to-do lists, things that went wrong, could go wrong, planning for the future. It tends to be a little bit negative and stressful in tone. And what meditation does is it moves you out of rumination into the attention networks. And as a consequence, you avoid a lot of that rumination. Over time, what happens is that you actually start to change your emotional reactivity. You change your stress reactivity. You become more resilient to stress. You become more somewhat in control of your emotions. Your life becomes a little bit more self-regulated from that perspective. And that really is one of the largest changes that yoga practices and other meditation practices provide, is this enormous change in stress reactivity and stress tolerance. I think that contributes largely to a lot of yoga's benefits, not only for the general public for maintaining health, but also for yoga as a therapeutic intervention. And the reason for that is that most diseases have stress as a strong risk factor. And when we're talking about Alzheimer's disease, stress is a major risk factor. So that's why it has utility.
Straight.
Well, this is very, very helpful and very interesting indeed. And can you tell us, do you have, I heard you speak recently, I admit it, and you had some very interesting statistics about how many people are practicing yoga, and do you have those handy?
Yeah, I think I can address that to some degree. Let me start at the outset by saying that in general, yoga is growing very, very rapidly in terms of its popularity internationally. We have statistics in the United States because surveys have been done here. And those surveys suggest that currently upwards of 20 million people are actively practicing yoga in the United States. And in the survey that was conducted, when individuals were asked if they were not practicing yoga, if they were interested in practicing yoga to some degree, that was an additional 100 million people. So there's an enormous amount of interest in yoga practice. It has a very positive attitude or cachet in the public. In fact, it is such a popular thing that the advertising industry has been using it extensively to market products. And so if you're reading magazines or watching TV, you'll often see images of yoga practice during a pharmaceutical commercial. The idea being that they're portraying this state of health, and that is what sort of yoga is known for. The other aspect of yoga practice that's growing very rapidly is yoga for therapeutic purposes, both for prevention, for health maintenance, and also for actually treating disease, for reducing severity of symptoms of a variety of diseases. And so-called yoga therapy is being practiced by 6% of the population. So that is huge. I mean, any kind of percentage like that in the population is enormous and suggests that yoga has actually become a way of life in the United States. As American as apple pie, if you will. And that popularity is growing by leaps and bounds. A survey by the federal government that was conducted in 2002 and 2007 showed that yoga grew in prevalence from 5% to 6%, which is a 1% increase in 5 years. And even if you assume that that is just a linear increase, that would mean that in 15 years from now, 10% of the population is going to be practicing yoga. And 10% of the population doing anything is huge.
Huge.
So popularity of yoga really has taken off, and it really has become an integral part of our culture. It's no longer something foreign. Americans really have adopted yoga as part of American life.
Yes, yes. I think that, we're seeing it from just even the few people that have shared with us earlier, the reason for coming on the teleseminar today, Jane, who's a yoga teacher, and Stu, who's enrolled in this study on yoga. So we see a lot of people have interest in realizing the health benefit of practicing yoga, in some form or the other. And we'll get to that. We'll get the different forms of yoga. So we were talking, we're talking about the brain, and would you like to tell us about how I mean, you've talked about it, but how does yoga meditation affect our mood, and how does that work?
Well, from the contemplative practice and also from the postures and the breathing techniques, what you do is you actually reduce the activity of the stress systems in the body. There is a system in the body called the fight or flight response. And that system is a natural built-in system that allows us to react to stressors. So you walk into the woods, you meet the proverbial bear in the woods, and suddenly your brain interprets this as a threat, and appropriate changes take place in the body. And that's what the fight or flight response is. The body prepares you either to fight the bear or to run away. And this is called the stress response. And a number of changes happen in the autonomic nervous system. There are stress hormones released, and your body is able to then cope with the threat. Now, in modern society, we're no longer facing bears, but we are facing other problems. We're facing road rage. We're facing, unemployment. We're facing even an overdrawn checkbook. And we're constantly confronted with stressors throughout the day. And in modern society, that chronic stress, if it's not handled or managed appropriately, starts to build into a chronic stress state, where there's elevated levels of stress hormones, elevated levels of sympathetic activity in the autonomic nervous system. You're basically hyped up and overstressed without relief from that stress. And chronic stress has enormous impact on the body. It negatively impairs the immune system. It actually kills brain cells. It impairs function, and it also is a major risk factor for mood disorders. So one of the greatest risk factors for major mood disorders like depression and anxiety is chronic stress. So when you practice yoga, you are basically inhibiting those stress responses, allowing the body to cope more effectively with stress. And it's happening at the level of perception. Through the meditative practices, you are interpreting the world slightly differently through the meditation practice. That is due to your reduction in emotional and stress reactivity to the world around you. So people who practice yoga on a regular basis are a little bit more calm, they're a little bit more focused, they're a little bit more capable of handling the stress that they were handling before. And that, of course, reduces chronic stress, improves mood. And in fact, many people will get an immediate effect of practicing yoga. Over the course of a few minutes, this reduction in arousal, this sense of well-being. And as one continues to practice over time, that change in well-being starts to become more ensconced. And there's actually structural changes that take place in the brain where people become more resilient to stress and less impaired with respect to their mood. And as people practice even longer, I believe what happens is that people start to experience more transcendent states. They get a more unitive experience. It's actually a transformational contemplative practice, enhancing things like spirituality and a sense of oneness. So there's a whole, we don't know all of the changes that are taking place from the exercises, the physical exercises and the breathing techniques, but we do know that these transformative changes are taking place as people practice over the long term.
Yeah, and how does that correlate to sleep? Because I know you're a sleep expert, and unfortunately, we all know that sleep issues. I mean, I think 60% of Americans have sleep problems. So how does yoga, impact sleep?
Well, one of the biggest sleep disorders is actually insomnia, which is the inability to fall asleep or stay asleep during the night. And one of the biggest factors involved in chronic insomnia, which affects up to 15% of the population, is chronic arousal. Chronic arousal of the body, chronic arousal of the emotions, and cognitive arousal. People are basically reacting to the stress in their lives and unable to cope with that. And stress and arousal really account for a large part of insomnia. And so as you start to practice these techniques to reduce stress in your life, many people report anecdotally that their sleep improves after they've started practicing yoga. And of course, my laboratory has conducted a randomized controlled trial of yoga intervention for insomnia, as have other laboratories showing positive benefit for yoga practice in elevating sleep quality and reducing insomnia. And sleep is actually a very sensitive biological function. Slightest disturbance can actually disturb your sleep. And you know behaviorally that if you've got an exam the next day or a court case or something stressful the next day, even getting married, that your sleep will be lighter and more disturbed the night before. So sleep is actually a very sensitive mind-body marker of chronic stress. And it's something that immediately improves when you start to practice yoga.
Well, that's food for thought, that's for sure, because it's needed. And I often wonder, when I hear, of course we all watch TV and we see, these ads for all the sleeping medications and things like that, and I often wonder, maybe we could at least reduce our need for these sleeping medications if we if we practice yoga, and that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. I mean, I think that the behavioral treatments for insomnia and this whole idea of reducing stress to improve insomnia is now pretty much well established. The problem is that sleep medicine is not well understood in medical schools or not taught in medical schools. And it's not really represented by primary care physicians. So there's a bit of a lack of knowledge there. Furthermore, many people are not aware of the fact that there are sleep doctors and that there are things like sleep hygiene with sleep recommendations for positive behaviors with regards to sleep. And so in the vacuum where that knowledge is not reaching the general public, the thing that is reaching the general public is the pharmaceutical companies. And that's unfortunate because what's happening is the American public is getting information on practices for insomnia that are not the most effective and the most long-term benefit. Furthermore, my real complaint with medications for insomnia, aside from the fact that they come with side effects, you're taking drugs that affect the brain widely. Aside from the side effects that come along with that, what's happening when you take these sleeping pills is that you're not really treating the underlying disorder. You're not treating the reason for your insomnia. You're basically knocking your brain out to make it fall asleep. And what happens with many people who take sleeping pills for insomnia, as soon as they stop taking the sleeping pills, their insomnia comes right back, which is really a sign that you're not treating the underlying reason for your insomnia. You're basically masking it. And these behavioral practices for insomnia really address the underlying cause for the insomnia, which is, in most cases, this arousal of the autonomic nervous system and the stress.
Right.
So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that we are, unfortunately, a society which has become to rely upon our doctors for our health care and our maintenance. And so when people have a problem like insomnia, they go to the doctor and basically essentially blame the doctor and ask for instant relief. And that usually comes in the form of a sleeping pill. And if people are then confronted with the idea of, well, you have to do something to maintain your health, you have to do some practices or some behavioral interventions, many people will actually resist that. And that's unfortunate because the responsibility for health care really has to depend upon the individual and not on the doctor treating the patient, but rather on the patient maintaining behavioral practices to keep themselves healthy.
Well, that's another very good point and another food for thought. That's for sure. Thank you for speaking to that. I wanted to ask you about your view and on the research studies that the Alzheimer's Research and Prevention Foundation has been sponsoring, and you're familiar with the work. And there, for those that don't know, the ARPF has been studying in various different scientific modalities, but meditation, brain function, and memory. And so, since you're familiar with these studies, what do you think is the implication for aging baby boomers and anyone concerned about their memory? Because we do study yoga meditation, and so what do you think is the implication?
Well, I think these ARPF studies are landmark studies. I think that it is unequivocally accepted that stress and the default mode network are major risk factors for cognitive decline and as risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. And so the study of these meditation practices with very powerful techniques like brain imaging and molecular biology techniques are critical to really demonstrate that there are brain changes that take place with yoga-type practices, and that these are real. Yoga is not just a hobby. It's not something that is lightly done just for recreational purposes. It actually is a brain-changing phenomenon in a positive way. There are real changes that take place at the molecular level in the brain, and these reduce the risk factors for cognitive decline or Alzheimer's disease. So that I think is really critical.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yes. Well, that's exactly why we're doing it because we've seen the changes, and we are still pursuing and additional studies, and we want if there is something that can be done that we can all do, and it's relatively easy, and it will create positive changes in the brain and improve memory and we don't know reverse, but at least reduce our risk for developing Alzheimer's or memory loss. It's worth it. We're all getting older, and there's such a need. So thank you for your support in that. And we are now at about 20 minutes to 6 o'clock over here, California time. And I would like to open this up for questions because I know we have a lot of attendees. So if you have is this a good time for you, Sadbir?
Yes, this is fine.
To get questions? Okay, great. And if you have a question, would you please unmute yourself by pressing *7 and ask the question, and Dr. Khalsa will address your question.
Yeah, Curdy?
Yes.
This is Stu Gross. I don't have a question. I have to leave. I have a board meeting to go to. But I did forward to you all the information on the study at the UCSD Stein Institute on yoga and aging.
Thank you. I received it. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, very good. Thank you very much. This was extremely interesting.
Very good. Thank you. I'm glad that we could help.
Okay. Yeah, bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for joining us. And if there's anyone else that would like to ask a question, please.
Hi, this is Judith.
Oh, Judith, welcome.
Thank you. The best form of yoga and for insomnia, what would that be?
Well, I think that's an open question. I mean, obviously, we have not had the time for the money to do the research that really has demonstrated all of the different types of interventions that you use with yoga for insomnia. What I can basically give you is perhaps a hand-waving argument that is a logical one. And I would therefore, and it's often asked, so yoga is good for insomnia, what would you do? Well, I would suggest that one adopts a form of yoga practice that emulates the traditional form of yoga practice. It includes all of these components, not only the physical posture, the exercises, but importantly also the breathing practices and the meditation component, and even the lifestyle and philosophical component. Complete package where yoga is sort of taught as a lifestyle. That, I think, is most likely to give the greatest benefit. Now, a related issue with that is not just the style of yoga, but also how much would you need to practice. And I think if you practice yoga once a month, expecting that your chronic insomnia would go away, I think you'd be a negative surprise. Obviously, this is a behavioral intervention. And one of the things about mind-body medicine and behavioral medicine is that if you don't do it, it won't work. And so the more you do it, the more benefit you will get. And I think for something like chronic insomnia, which has taken years to develop in many cases, it takes a few months of consistent, regular practice to be able to reduce the overall chronic arousal in your system, be able to restore your natural balance of arousal and normal sleep. And so I would suggest that people would want to practice at least 2 to 3 times per week, perhaps an hour class, to attend yoga classes fairly regularly, and this should happen over a couple of months in order to get effects. I think it would be unrealistic to take 3 yoga classes over 2 weeks and expect that suddenly that's going to turn things around. It does take time. But the positive about that, the positive about the investment of all of that time practicing yoga is that not only will you be treating the underlying cause of your insomnia, you will most likely endure positive side effects. What I mean by that is that you'll get an improvement in well-being, an improvement in mood, improvement in cognitive functioning, improvement in pain and physical activity. There's a lot of positives that come with yoga practice. It actually changes you on many levels in a positive direction. So that's what I would recommend for people who really have an ongoing problem.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. And I guess we're ready for the next question. If I may just interject one quick announcement, because I know we're gonna come to the end, and then we're all leaving. And I wanted to let everyone know that we are preparing another free program next month on November 7th. It's going to be a webinar where you can actually see our speakers, and it's going to be called the Super Brain Lifestyle Webinar. And to find out more, you can go to alzheimersprevention.org. We will also send an email announcement. And again, it will be free of charge. And our distinguished speakers will be Mariel Hemingway, who is a health advocate and a yoga practitioner, as I'm sure many of you know. And we have Lori LaBey, who is a Alzheimer's caregiving advocate. And then we have our own president and medical director, Dr. Bir Khalsa, who will be speaking in detail about the results of our research. So check it out and sign up at alzheimersprevention.org. And again, it's a free webinar where you can watch from your computer, and we'll have plenty of interactive activities. So after this announcement, any other questions for Dr. Sadbir? You can unmute yourself by pressing *7.
Could you spell before the next question, could you spell his name?
Yes. Sadbir, would you like to do that?
Sure. My last name is Khalsa. K as in king, H as in hat, A as in apple, L as in Larry, S as in son, A as in apple. And my first name is Satbir, Satbir.
Satbir. And what's the name of your book?
The book is called Your Brain on Yoga. It's available exclusively through Amazon.com. It's an e-book. It's set up as a Kindle, but it also can be downloaded for reading on a PC.
Thank you.
Or an iPhone. I have it on my iPhone. Yes, so any other questions?
Yes, my name is Sharon, and I'm from Reno, Nevada.
One moment, I could not hear a word. Can you please say your name again?
My name is Karen.
Karen?
Can you hear me? Yes, and I'm from Reno, Nevada.
Yes.
And I teach yoga up at the VA hospital. And we're just reintroducing or trying to get yoga more to the veterans. And so I deal with a lot of different issues, and not just Alzheimer's. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
So I'm wondering, I know this is about Alzheimer's and it's about yoga. I'm also wondering about families in yoga. And do they participate in yoga so that they can understand what the patient or client what is trying to get across so they can put themselves?
I think I heard most of your question. Sadbir, was it clear to you?
Yeah, I think I can take a stab at it.
Okay.
I think you're asking about not only patients practicing yoga, but also their family members practicing yoga. And I think that's a very great positive. You work in the VA, and I actually have conducted a study funded by the Department of Defense to look at yoga as a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. And of course, the military population is under severe chronic stress, including the families who have to endure the separation of loved ones and so on. So it affects not only military personnel, but families as well. And one of the negatives about yoga practice is its sort of general, one of the general views of yoga in public is that it's basically something practiced by women, hobby. And that doesn't usually fly well with a lot of military personnel. And so one of the things
I'm sorry to interrupt, but there is so much background noise. I hear people screaming, dogs barking. So please, if you do have that background noise, please mute yourself, *6, so we can finish the teleseminar here. I'm sorry to interrupt. Please, Satbir.
Sure. So I think it's important for military personnel, veterans, to have support from their family, to help them get past this initial perception of yoga as something that is new agey or something that is for women only or something that is just a hobby. Because as people start to practice, as veterans start to practice these techniques, they pretty quickly experience what these techniques are capable of. And I think most of them are really quite surprised. Just to give you one anecdote, we had in our research trial a military veteran who basically admitted that he joined the trial because we were remunerating subjects for their participation. And he thought yoga was nothing. It was just a waste of time. But then he quickly found after practicing that it was really making changes and that it was a real phenomenon. So I think getting family members involved to practice together, of course, the other thing about family members is that they're under chronic stress as well. And so yoga can help the family members cope with the stress of being in a military family. For having a veteran who's disabled. And particularly one of the greatest stressors in families is caregivers who are family spouses, members of veterans with either traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress disorder. This is enormously stressful on family members. So I think yoga practice for the entire family, including the veteran, him or herself, I think is a great benefit.
That's absolutely true. I think we'll see more and more. I think I've seen many more ongoing studies on stress, as a comprehensive approach to healing for post-traumatic stress disorder. So, Karen, I hope we answered your question.
You answered it very well. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Is there any other question?
I have a question.
Yes.
Hello, this is Dr. Khalsa. Dr. Khalsa, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. My question has to do also with PTSD, but not just in veterans or soldiers, but there's a lot of work now coming out on yoga and meditation in survivors of trauma, child abuse, and so on, who are suffering from PTSD later in life. And what is your feeling about that and your experience with that?
Yeah, I think there's an enormous amount of interest now in incorporating yoga and meditation practices for post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is really a mind-body disorder. The conventional treatments for PTSD have largely focused on cognitive approaches. So things like exposure therapy and psychotherapy. And one of the things about PTSD is that there's an enormous amount of bodily symptoms. People are hyper-aroused. They have difficulty sleeping. They have a real startle response. And high levels of chronic tension and stress. There's also a strong mind-body dissociation. They're dissociated from their bodies. Their levels of physical activity are much reduced. And so it makes a lot of sense to approach mind-body disorder with a mind-body intervention. And so we have now published in the literature about a half a dozen of yoga practices for post-traumatic stress disorder, whether that trauma was induced through combat or through a tsunami or through sexual abuse. The results are all pretty much the same. Yoga is really effective at reducing the symptoms of PTSD, and in fact, I believe, on the long term, capable of actually reversing the disease altogether. And one of the beauties of this practice is that the patient does not have to relive the trauma in order to go through the therapy. In fact, the rebalancing of the nervous system takes place automatically through the practices. There's biochemical and structural changes that take place in the brain when you practice these contemplative practices that avoids the need for patients to go and relive the trauma in some kind of exposure psychotherapy format. And I think that's a real advantage here.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great. That makes sense. Oh, my goodness. We still have so much background noise. We have time for probably one more question or maybe two short questions. If you do have a question, will you please state your name and then the question?
Sharon again, and I have another question. Can you hear me?
Is this Karen?
Yes, I have another question.
Okay.
I am wondering, through all of his scientific research and everything, where does it come up where there's a discussion about the principles of yoga? And is that discussed with, of course it wouldn't be discussed with the Alzheimer's patients, but what about just everyday people, about the principles of yoga? Because I find that when people start to practice the yamas and the niyamas, and they really start to take a look at themselves, because that's when I think people start to open up.
Okay, that's a question that's very reasonable. I think, in my opinion, that
Sadbir, would you like to restate the question?
Sure. The question is how important and how much impact does sort of the other aspects of yoga, the philosophical and psychological components of yoga practice, tie into the actual practice themselves. And I think that I believe that if you practice all of the physical postures, exercises, the breathing techniques, meditation components, you will have the vast majority of benefit in those practices. However, I think that if you start to talk about yoga lifestyle issues and add those, the philosophical and psychological issues, discussions around those, I think that can enhance the practice and may provide some additional benefit. I don't think that those are essential. I think they can add benefit, but I think the majority of benefit actually comes from the practices themselves. And people will ultimately, in my view, come to the philosophical and psychological change simply through the practices themselves. And we've seen this time and time again. So, for example, we are conducting studies of yoga in schools, and we have 14-year-old boys who are assigned to the yoga intervention who really don't want to do the yoga. They consider this for girls, and it's nonsense. And that's the attitude they come into it with. But after actually having to do the practices themselves, a month later, they are actually defending these practices as positive, providing positive benefit, and they're defending these practices. They actually experience these changes. And the changes actually come along with a philosophical transformation. So yes, I agree that discussing yamas and niyamas and the philosophy and so on can help, but I think the majority of benefit really comes from doing the practices themselves.
All right.
Thank you.
May I ask you a question? There are people who have their speakerphones on or something, and when they make a sound, it interrupts your voice.
I know. We've been struggling with this for a whole hour. I've been asking people to mute themselves, and
actually, if they push, there's I think *6. It might mute their phones.
Right.
Whoa.
Yes. Well, we are at the closing of the call. If I would like to suggest, if anybody has questions that still would like to ask, you can feel free to email us at info@alzheimersprevention.org, and we will pass them on to Dr. Sadbir, and we'll try to respond in a timely manner. And so I'm grateful to all the participants in the call, and very grateful to Dr. Sadbir. Thank you so much for joining us and for discussing this important topic with us and explaining all these really interesting aspects of yoga, your brain and on our brain and our mood and our health. And I look forward to talking to everybody on the 7th, on November 7th. And again, the information and the details are at alzheimersprevention.org. And Sadbir, would you like to have a finishing, say goodbye to her? Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for participating. It's been a pleasure to share this information with you. And I encourage everyone, of course, to actually practice yoga.
Perfect. And again, a reminder, Dr. Sadbir's ebook is called Your Brain on Yoga, and if you Google it, it will come up on Amazon.com. So thank you so much for joining us. It is we're now at the hour, and we wish you a very good evening, and we'll talk again in a month.